Okay, so now that we've gone over how you name an angle, parts of an angle, interior, exterior, points in an angle, let's talk about different ways to classify angles. You've probably already heard of these before. And the first way we're going to classify an angle is if we have an angle whose measure is exactly 90 degrees. And you will see a box in the corner that shows that it's exactly 90 degrees. And this is what is called a right angle. So let's call this A. We would say that the measure of angle A is 90 degrees. The second way we would classify an angle, let's say this is angle B, and clearly angle B is less than this 90 degrees, and that is what we would call an acute angle. And an acute angle, so let's say this is measure angle B, measure of angle B would be less than 90 degrees. And the final way to classify an angle is that if it's greater than 90 degrees, so let's say angle C here is greater than 90 degrees, we would call it an obtuse angle. So we would say the measure of angle C is greater than 90 degrees. Okay, now that we've learned the three ways to classify an angle, I'd like for you to copy this figure here and make sure that you have MJP as 90 degrees. There's a box here. Copy this into your notes and then we will classify each angle. So go ahead and pause the video. I'm going to go ahead and ask the questions. Let's say I wanted to know what MJP was. Classify angle MJP. Go ahead and write down your response. An angle MJP is a right angle. This box right here shows that it is exactly 90 degrees. Okay, go ahead and pause the video and see what you think angle LJP would be. An angle LJP is greater than 90. Here's the 90. LJP is greater than 90, so we would call it obtuse. And then finally, what do you think angle NJP would be? Pause the video and see what you get. And you should have had that NJP is acute. It is less than that 90 degrees. Congruent angles are just like congruent segments. They're going to be two angles with exactly the same measure. So let's say that these two angles were exactly the same measure. And with congruent segments, we marked them with hash marks. With congruent angles, we're going to mark them congruent by putting an arc to show that they're congruent. And the fact that they both have one arc means that they're both the same angle measure. If I had another set of angles on my picture that were the same measure, then I would use two arcs. And that shows that these two are congruent and then these two are congruent. So you're going to keep going up in arcs as you get more pictures with congruent angles. An angle bisector is a ray that divides an angle into two congruent angles. So let's say that we have an angle, and then let's say that we have a ray that is the angle bisector. So what that means is that it cuts this main angle, trying to make them look congruent, it cuts this main angle in half into two congruent angles. So we would mark that these two angles are congruent by putting an arc on each separate angle. So let's do a little bit of practice with that. Let's say in the figure that ray KJ and KM are opposite rays, KJ and KM are opposite rays, and that KN right here bisects JKL. So that means we should automatically put an arc here and an arc here because we said that KN was the angle bisector. Then they said that JKN, this angle right here, is 8x minus 13. And we want to be marking this in our picture. And you will have drawn this picture. And angle NKL, N to K to L, is 6x plus 11. Well, this mark right here says that these two angles are congruent. And in algebra, in order to find the measure of angle JKN, we're going to have to find x. So in order to do that, if these two angles are congruent, so if angle JKN is congruent to angle NKL, that's the same thing as saying that their measures are equal. So I would substitute in what the measure of JKN is. JKN is 8x minus 13. And then NKL is 6x plus 11. First I have to find x. So what I'm going to do is add 13 to both sides. So I would get 8x equals 6x plus 24. I would subtract 6x from both sides. So I would get 2x equals 24. And then I would divide by 2 on both sides. So I would get that x is 12. But I don't stop there because it asked me to find JKN. And JKN is 8x minus 13. So I'm going to substitute in this x. So JKN is 8 times 12 minus 13. So that gives me the measure of angle JKN is 83 degrees. Also make sure you go back and check to make sure this angle is 83 degrees as well. 6 times 12 plus 11 is in fact 83 degrees. So these two are congruent angles. Okay, go ahead and take a minute to copy down this figure and this question. It says in the figure the measure of angle STR, so here to here to here, S to T to R, is 90 degrees. So I'm going to put a box here to show you that it's 90 degrees. Use angle addition. Angle addition is just like segment addition, and it says this angle plus this angle, WTR, equals the whole thing, which we said is 90 degrees. So we would set up our equation to say that angle STW plus angle WTR equals STR, S to T to R, which is 90 degrees. So now I'm going to substitute my values in, and I would say 2x plus WTR is 5x plus 6 equals 90. And now I'd like for you to solve the equation to find x, STW, and WTR. Okay, so you should have gotten that x is 12, the measure of angle STW is 24 degrees, and WTR is 66 degrees. And then I substituted back in just to check to see if I did my math right, and 24 plus 66 is in fact 90, so that I know I did the equation right. If you did not get what I got, or you need a little bit of help, just raise your hand. Okay, this next one's going to take a second. The first is, what is a segment bisector? Segment bisector is a line, ray, or segment that divides a segment into two congruent parts. So let's say here we want to find the measure of PQ if Q is the midpoint or the segment bisector of PR. So if this is the midpoint or the segment bisector, then this PQ would be congruent to QR, and I would show that using hash marks. Now, before we had segment addition, which said part plus part equals the whole thing, but we don't have the whole thing. The only thing we have in this equation, or this problem, is that these two parts are equal to each other because Q is the midpoint. So just like we did up here with angle bisector, the problem before this one, we set the two angles congruent. So that's exactly what we'll do here. Because PQ is congruent to QR, then I would say that PQ, which is 9y minus 2, is equal to QR, which is 14 plus 5y. Now I'd like for you to take a moment to solve for the variable, which is y, and then find the measure of PQ. Okay, so you should have gotten that y is 4 and that PQ, once we substituted the 4 in, is 34. I also went back and checked my work just to make sure that 14 plus 5 times 4 was also 34, and it was. So these two were both 34, which means that they were congruent, which means that I did the equation right. Okay, now you can move on to your homework where page 41, 13 through 27 odd, and 37 through 41 odd.